Maggie was a second-year college student and often worked as a babysitter. She considered it an easy job. You come, watch so that the children don't do stupid things, put them to bed and watch TV shows all evening. Almost always, her clients were quiet families from the suburbs, where cozy houses hid behind high fences. No one asked unnecessary questions, because Maggie gave the impression of a reliable girl, and her parents paid her a good sum for peace of mind. One evening, a woman named Mrs. Harper called her. She said she was looking for a babysitter for one night. The voice sounded calm, but somehow tense. She added that the matter was urgent. They had a family evening, and their 8-year-old son Jake could not stay alone at home. Maggie agreed, although the call itself made her a little tense. But the money the woman offered was too good to refuse. Mrs. Harper met her at the door of a small but cozy 2-story house. She briefly explained the rules. Jake has already had dinner, he needs to brush his teeth at 8:30 and go to bed no later than 9. When leaving, the woman gave Maggie a phone number and said they would be back late. Everything looked ordinary, even boring. Maggie met Jake, a quiet boy with big eyes and a wary look. He was sitting on the couch, staring at his tablet. She thought that the evening would not be difficult at all. The child seemed calm, and the whole house was perfectly clean. Time passed slowly. Jake sat silently in the living room, and only occasionally glanced at Maggie. Around 8 o'clock, she decided it was time to occupy him with something else. "Jake, what do you like to do?" "What is it?" she asked. The boy looked away from the screen and shrugged his shoulders. "I can show you the house," he said quietly. Maggie agreed. Jake took her around the house, telling her little things about each room. There were cups with logos of children's parties in the kitchen, his parents' bedroom was in perfect order, and his own room was decorated with posters of superheroes. But one detail in his behavior seemed strange to her. As they passed the basement door, Jake suddenly stopped talking and walked faster, as if he didn't want her to notice her. "What's in there?" Maggie asked. "This is the basement," the boy replied shortly, without stopping. "Can I see it?" she suggested, but Jake turned around abruptly. "No. You can't go there." Maggie hesitated. The boy's tone was too serious, and she decided not to insist. By 9, Jake was already in his bed. Maggie stayed in the living room, sitting comfortably on the couch. The TV was on, but she couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts went back to the basement. Why did the boy react so strangely? Perhaps the parents keep something there that they don't want to show the children. But that's okay, all families have their secrets. An hour later, there was a faint noise, as if something had creaked. Maggie shuddered. It was the sound of a door. She looked around, the front doors were locked. Maybe Jake got out of bed? She went upstairs, but the boy was asleep in his room. His breathing was even, and the tablet was lying on the bedside table. Returning downstairs, she noticed that the door to the basement was slightly ajar. My heart stopped beating. Maggie cautiously approached the door and lit up the dark steps with her phone. She wasn't going to come down, she just wanted to make sure no one was there. But something strange caught her eye. At the very bottom of the steps was a small, childish shoe. It was dirty, as if it had just been pulled out of the ground. She felt a chill run down her spine. Her phone vibrated, snapping her out of her daze. It was an unknown number. A message appeared on the screen: "Don't come down. Stay upstairs." Maggie froze, but plucked up the courage to go down anyway. At the last step, she stopped, looking around. It was an ordinary basement with shelves filled with boxes. But her gaze caught on the dirty shoe again. A little further away, there was another pair. My heart started pounding harder. Suddenly Jake's voice came from behind. "I told you that you can't come here." She turned around. Jake was standing on the top step, holding a kitchen knife in his hands. "You're lying like them, too," he said. Maggie staggered back, but slipped and fell. She felt a sharp pain in her leg. Jake didn't move. He just stood there and looked at her. "It's you. Killed them?" "What is it?" she asked, gasping in pain. "No. I helped him. He said you should leave. Or you'll be next." There was a noise from behind. A man's figure appeared in the shadow of the basement. It was their neighbor, the same good-natured man who had helped Mrs. Harper fix the plumbing the day before. "What did I say?" "She found us," he said calmly. "Well, Maggie, it's your turn now." Maggie felt the blood rush to her head. Fear gripped her, and every movement seemed unreal, as if it were happening in slow motion. A man with rough features walked slowly down the stairs, his shoes creaking on the wood. He was holding something like an iron hook in his hands, which he brandished with frightening confidence. "I told you to just watch, Jake. Why did you let her come down here?" The man turned to the boy, without taking his eyes off Maggie. Jake frowned, but took a step back, clutching the knife to himself as if defending himself. "She climbed on her own." "It's not my fault," he said softly. Maggie was panting from the exertion. The man came closer, his figure blocking the passage. She tried to back away, but she hit an old wooden shelf, and a box fell off it, slamming loudly on the floor. This made the man freeze, and Jake shrugged nervously. "You could just watch TV," the man said calmly. "But now you've seen something you shouldn't have." Maggie glanced at the dirty boots lying next to her. At that moment, she realized that they didn't belong to Jake. The shoes were too small. A little to the side, she noticed another detail, a small plastic container, tightly closed with a lid. There was a strange glint inside, like wet hair. "What did you do?" she breathed out. The voice trembled treacherously. The man grunted as he squatted down. "This is a house where secrets are hidden," he said. "And I'm just protecting them. Everyone who works here understands this. And you? Would you understand?" Maggie didn't know what to say. She tensed, preparing to make a dash. The man noticed this, but, to her surprise, made no attempt to stop her. Instead, he pointed to a door that led to a narrow tunnel deep in the basement. "If you want to survive, run there. You wanted an adventure, didn't you? Here they are. Let's see what you're worth." Maggie glanced at Jake. He didn't move, but his hands were visibly shaking. The man came closer, took the knife from the boy and, without taking his eyes off Maggie, pointed at the door again. "You have 5 minutes before we start hunting." She wasn't thinking. "I just ran." The cold air met her in the narrow tunnel, and the footsteps of her opponents echoed behind her. The tunnel was long and low, and after a few dozen meters she could barely breathe from fear and fatigue. Turn by turn, she searched for a way out, but it seemed that the walls were narrowing, trapping her. There was a muffled sound from behind. The man and Jake followed her, their footsteps getting closer. She found an old door covered in rust and yanked on the handle. The door gave way, and she found herself in a room filled with old metal cabinets. There were battered notebooks and someone's personal belongings on the floor, children's toys, shoes, photo albums. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to slow her breathing. In one of the photos lying next to her, she saw a smiling family. The man in the photo was the neighbor. There were children standing around him, the same ones whose shoes she saw in the basement. The door slammed open. The man entered, holding a hook in his hand. Jake stood behind him, looking scared but obedient. "I found you," the man said, and a sickly smile appeared on his face. "No one leaves this house until I want them to." But before he could get any closer, Jake suddenly lunged at Maggie, grabbing her arm. His eyes were filled with horror. "Run!" he shouted. "Run while you still have a chance." The man grabbed the boy's shoulder in a rage, but Jake resisted, distracting his attention. Maggie took advantage of the moment and rushed out of the room. She ran without looking back until she reached the stairs leading outside. Her hands were shaking when she finally managed to open the heavy door leading to the courtyard. She ran out of the house and, without remembering herself, stopped a car passing by. The terrified driver called the police. When the police arrived, no one was at home. The basement turned out to be empty, with no traces of dirty shoes or containers. They didn't even find any photos. The neighbor who was supposed to be in his house turned out to be registered on a completely different street. The Harper family just disappeared as if they had never existed. And the house's database had a completely different address. The police continued to investigate, but the evidence seemed to evaporate. Every time Maggie tried to describe events, her testimony was viewed with disbelief. The next day, she got a call from the nanny agency to ask a strange question. "I'm sorry, miss, but are you sure you gave the address correctly? The Harper family is not registered in our database. We never sent you there." Maggie froze. She checked the text she received before starting her shift and felt a chill inside. The message from the agency has indeed disappeared. The panic was growing. She began to wonder if she had been deliberately lured into this house. But who? And why? Trying to find at least some answers, Maggie went to the city archives. She needed to make sure that the house existed, that it belonged to someone at all. When the archivist, an elderly woman with a tired face, found the necessary notes, she was silent for a long time before saying, "This house is listed as demolished. 15 years ago." Maggie was stunned. "This is a mistake. I was there yesterday," she exclaimed. The woman shook her head. "The only thing I can show you are the old reports. There was a fire. 2 families died. The house was never restored." Even more confused, Maggie left the archive. But she knew what she saw. The house was standing. People were there. She decided to come back. At sunset, Maggie drove back to the place where, according to her memory, the house should have been. But she was horrified. In the place where the 2-story building stood yesterday, there was only a grassy wasteland. No signs of life. She walked around the area as if in search of something that could prove the reality of her experience. And suddenly, among the tall grass, she noticed a small, dust-covered object. It was the same plastic box she had seen in the basement. Her hands were shaking when she opened it. There were old photos inside, of children, adults, family pictures. And on each of them stood a man she recognized. The same neighbor who drove her into the tunnel. There was another item in the box, a small piece of paper. On it, in a sprawling handwriting, was written, "You shouldn't have come back." Maggie felt her blood freeze in her veins. A slight rustle came from behind her. She turned around. On the horizon, in the thicket, the silhouette of a man was slowly approaching. His face was in shadow, but she knew who it was. When the police responded to the call later that night, only a box was found in the wasteland. Neither Maggie nor any signs of a struggle were found. The case has joined the list of unexplained disappearances. Maggie's family, her friends, and colleagues were all shocked. Over time, the story was forgotten, and only the closest sometimes remembered her on the anniversary of her disappearance. And in the neighboring city, on a quiet street, a man who looked very much like that neighbor was calmly trimming bushes near his house. There was a plastic photo box on his porch. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that someone was constantly watching her. At night she had nightmares, dark corridors, children crying and ominous laughter. But the oddities didn't end there. A few days after her visit to the archivist, she found an envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a black and white photograph. The picture was of herself standing in a vacant lot where, in her opinion, the Harper house had recently stood. The picture was taken from a great distance, but the angle of the shot was as if the photographer was standing there all the time, watching. There was only one word on the back of the photo: back. Maggie, overcome with fear, went to the police. But the detective she came to see was just frowning. "This could just be a prank, miss," he muttered, scanning the photo. "This is not a prank," she exclaimed. "This house, this man, they are real. We checked your call. You called from a neighborhood where there hasn't been a house in a decade. Whatever you see there, it doesn't exist." Maggie shook her head stubbornly. "I'll go back there," she muttered. "This is a bad idea, miss," the detective warned. "But she's already decided." That night Maggie came back to the wasteland. This time she took a flashlight and a small pepper spray with her. She knew it wasn't the best weapon, but it was something. Looking around the place, she noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints on the ground. They led directly to what used to be the basement of the house. In a place where the grass grew less thickly, she found a metal manhole cover. Opening it with difficulty, Maggie saw a narrow descent down. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to echo. She turned on the flashlight and slowly began to descend. It turned out to be cold and damp underground. The narrow hallway was filled with old trash, cracked cans, torn blankets, scraps of newspapers. But then she saw the door. There were deep scratches on its surface, as if someone was trying to get out. Maggie pushed open the door, and it opened with a high-pitched squeak. There was a room inside, and in the center was an old wooden table. There were photographs on it. They were the same pictures she'd found in the box: children, families, and that man again. But this time she noticed something new. She saw herself in the background of one of the pictures. Shocked, she recoiled. How is this possible? These photos were taken a long time ago, long before she was born. She began to feverishly sort through the pictures until she came across one particularly ominous one. It depicted a girl who strongly resembled herself. Her hands were tied and her face was frozen in horror. The sound of footsteps came from behind him. Maggie turned around and saw a man. The one she considered a neighbor. This time, his clothes were stained with dried blood. "I knew you'd be back," he said softly, blocking the exit from the room. "Who are you?" she shouted, backing away. The man chuckled. "My name is John. Just John. I clean up what people like you leave behind." She didn't understand what he was talking about, but the next second he rushed towards her. Maggie grabbed the nearest object, a rusty pipe, and hit him on the head. The man staggered, and she rushed to the exit. But the corridors of the dungeon seemed endless. There were forks and dead ends everywhere, and soon she realized that she was lost. There were footsteps behind her. "You won't escape," he shouted. "No one hears the screams here." Maggie noticed a light ahead. She ran, struggling to keep her balance. The light led to the stairs. Climbing it, she found herself in an abandoned school building. This place looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. But for some reason, everything here was familiar to her. She noticed an old blackboard on the wall, on which it was written in large letters. "One day you will become a part of history." A voice came from behind her. "Welcome to the place where everything ends." She turned around. The man was standing in the doorway, holding something that looked like a knife. When the police arrived at the call, they were met only by a cold, abandoned corridor. At the end of a long passage, they found a metal box. There were photos inside. The last picture taken on film showed a woman. Her face was contorted with horror. Maggie was never seen again. And a few weeks later, a new candidate appeared at the nanny recruitment agency. A young girl with a big smile and great hope of finding a job.